Welcome! I am author D.M. Patterson, and in this video we are going to talk about the character's backstory. Sasha is here with me again today. I cannot put her outside the door because she will yell at the door and sometimes rams into it. So either you would be distracted by very strange noises or you're distracted by seeing some adorable cuteness. So I also want to say a big thank you to Mike. Thank you so much for suggesting I talk about the backstory of a character. Thank you for watching my channel and for your awesome friendship and support. I am also going to address, yes, I cut my hair. It is so much shorter than the last video that you saw. I will put a few pictures right after this clip to show you I donated my hair. I'm sorry I don't have an editing tool yet where I can put some, fun music or something for you to listen to when you look at the pictures, but I'll get there eventually. I do have a friend who is losing her hair to chemo because she is fighting cancer, and for her privacy, I'm not going to go into any more details. My friend Heroin Bob that I've mentioned on this channel before donated her hair as well, and she gave me the website to where I could send my hair after having it cut, and I'm very grateful for that. And I was also ready for a change. I was ready to have short hair, so I figured, yep, I'm gonna cut my hair off, I'm gonna donate it, and I'm also gonna just enjoy something very different for a while until it grows back out again, and then who knows, I might just keep donating it. Anyway, you did not come on this video to talk about my hair. Let's talk about the character's backstory. Now, there is a little bit of a difference, at least from my perspective, between a character's backstory and the origin story. A lot of times the origin story is applied to characters that are kind of like the heroes. Think Batman, so the comic heroes. Batman's origin story, we know that he had trauma in his childhood, and that kind of spun him into wanting to become a vigilante. And there's also, running along the same lines of Batman, there's a lot of question about what Joker's origin story is. So a lot of times when you think of an origin story, it's usually the more epic heroes. It's usually applied to something that is a little bit more larger than life. Sometimes also an origin story is applied to myths as well, like how humans came to be. So at least the way I'm dividing this a little bit for my channel, that's the definitions and sort of where I'm putting origin story versus a backstory. Where I would say a backstory is, think of the scenes or the things that happened before the book begins. So sometimes with origin stories, you read the whole origin story. There are a lot of books out there about the villain's origin story, and you're reading the entire story and you're seeing it all develop, which is another line where I would put, it's not necessarily a backstory then, because you're reading all of it as it develops. Whereas a lot of times when you refer to a character's backstory, usually it's something that has happened before the author has begun the story. And again, some people would potentially define that differently. Some people may put those lines in different places. Some people may even use them interchangeably. This is just how I'm sorting them out, so when I talk about a character's backstory, you know what I'm thinking of what I'm saying. So if a character has a backstory that has happened before the actual book, the action and the story begins in the book and the storytelling, then how do you refer back to it? A lot of times authors will use flashbacks. That's one of the easiest, probably most used way that an author will bring up a character's backstory. I will always say be very careful with anything that you decide to use to fill in the backstory. You don't want the entire story told in flashbacks. You really want to use those very sparingly. Another way an author tends to tell us what the backstory of a character is the monologue. So if you think of, the villain who's got the protagonist tied up in the chair and they give them all of their reasons why they're doing this, and I know now a lot of movies, a lot of literature, they're kind of making fun of that now by, the protagonist cutting them off and saying, okay, are you done? I don't want to hear this. And I would just pay attention to the genre and the feel of your story, and I would pay attention to whether or not a monologue fits, because a monologue is the same thing as an info dump. It is just the character dumping all the information in dialogue. And I would say, in any case, in all cases, be very careful of monologues / info dumping, because you really don't want to lose your reader because you just presented them with all this information. I will give you an example of a book where I thought the backstory was done very well and paced very well into the story. It is called The Beekeeper's Apprentice by Lori R. King. My good friend and fellow HCS editor and author Jeannie gave this book to me, and I absolutely love it. One thing I really appreciated, well, I appreciated many things about this book. It is written very well. But as far as Mary Russell, so Mary Russell is the protagonist in this story, and she meets Sherlock Holmes when Sherlock Holmes is supposed to be retired and keeping his bees. But Mary Russell has a backstory, and part of the bits and pieces that we do find out very early on is that she is an orphan living with her aunt. And Sherlock Holmes even picks up on that very quickly with his deduction, and it's really not anything that I'm giving away with the plot. And what happens is we see Mary Russell having nightmares every now and then, especially when she gets stressed out. And she doesn't tell us what the nightmares are, but eventually she's in a place where Sherlock Holmes hears that she's having a nightmare. He has to wake her up. He asks her if she's okay. She has to kind of get some fresh air. So we see that there is something else. There's another piece to this that is in the backstory that we don't know. We haven't figured it out yet, but it's very much affecting Mary as she's going on through this story. I really appreciate how Lori R. King sets that up. So if Mary, the character, were to start out the story by letting Sherlock know everything that happened and dumping her entire backstory out on him at the very beginning, it would not be as powerful, and their bond was not very strong at the beginning, and it would not have fit. Instead, we see as their bond develops, we still see that Mary is very much haunted by what happened. And then eventually, after they've gone on some adventures together, after their friendship has become very solid, they have a lot of trust between each other. It's very powerful because Sherlock is set up as someone who doesn't have those very emotional sides. And so eventually, when Mary opens up and tells Sherlock the rest of what happened, it's very powerful. It's very well done. It's in a right spot. There's been enough of the development of the story and the relationship so that it fits. And Mary is able to find some healing from what Sherlock says. And I think it is a wonderful example. I know it's kind of frustrating that I just gave an example of a book that potentially most of you have not read. I will say though, if you are interested in building a backstory and learning the timing and how it's subtly added in and the rest of the story and how the rest of the story was told to Sherlock Holmes, I highly recommend you read it. I will always say, read. If you are interested in writing, you have to read. Read the genre that you're writing, and then read outside of the genre that you're writing. There's so many amazing good examples of things like this. I would say that the backstory is very important for the author to have solid in their mind, regardless of how much of it gets put in the story. And I know I mentioned this before when I was talking about developing that 3D character, when I was talking about doing the interview with the character. It may not always make it into the story that the character's favorite color is orange, but the more solid that character is in your mind, the more solid they're going to read. And that backstory, developing what happened, what is the story with the character before the opening chapter, having that solid in your mind is going to continue moving the story forward as well. For example, if you have a character who is afraid of snakes, that's a very typical fear. I know a lot of people, I can name quite a few people off the top of my head who are afraid of snakes. It's pretty common. But if you have as part of their backstory, I don't know, something like they were walking in the woods with their family and a snake bit their leg and they had to run to the hospital and they were upset because this was one of the only times that their family was together. You know, you can play with something like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be trauma. It is pretty easy to go to trauma being part of an origin story, trauma being part of a backstory, and unfortunately it's because life is full of drama. It's a very harsh and sad reality that most people go through trauma. So yeah, it's pretty easy. Yeah, most people have that as part of their, you know, in real life as part of their backstory and what has made them who they are today. But try using different things. Also, remember when you write, you have more than one sense. And I really want to do a video on this too, making sure you're writing with all of your senses, not just things that you see. So if your character walks into somebody's house for the first time and they smell lavender, instantly they may have a memory that brings up. So smell, as we know, your smell brings up memories. It's very connected to the things that have happened in the past. Touch is a very important sense that, as I know as an author, I leave it out all the time. It's very hard to remember to put touch in there. But even feeling something, even feeling the textures of things, or not necessarily even how hot or cold it is, but you know, if you feel something that was knit by somebody, that those little holes in there have a different texture. So maybe having a character running their hand over something, and that texture brings up a lot of things, a lot of memories. This is connected to something from the past. And that's going to, once again, bring up a reaction that the other characters in the scene are going to react to, and you're going to move the plot forward. For me, when I hear a grandfather clock, I always instantly think about my grandparents' house and the beautiful grandfather clock they have there, and that brings back so many memories. Now, of course, you want to be careful with using things like this, because whatever is being brought up, and you know, for example, if your character hears Luciano Pavarotti and maybe starts crying because they miss their grandmother, don't have that be part of a backstory that isn't connected to something. So your character, if they are dealing with grief, yeah, absolutely. That is absolutely a great way to show this is something that is triggering a memory and I'm dealing with this grief. And again, it doesn't always have to be associated with negative things or trauma. So if your character remembers a very perfect day with their grandmother and that song happens to be playing, then awesome. So the character's backstory absolutely does play into the development of the character as well as the plot. How your characters, how all of them, you know, they all need to have development. They all need to be responding to things, not just the protagonist and the antagonist. If you have more than two characters in the story, they all need to have some development. So how those characters are responding to this person's backstory, whatever it is that has come up, whatever it is that has touched that backstory, can show their development as well. So that's what I mean by, you don't necessarily have to go into the whole story of for example, if it was me, you know, my character doesn't necessarily have to say, well, my grandmother died in 2013 of Parkinson's and it was really hard to see that go. You don't have to go into all those details. If you brought it up and that character is really sad, if the point is showing another character who is not responding to it, who doesn't know how to handle grief potentially, or potentially you're showing how kind a character is and how loving they are, there you go. And it doesn't necessarily have to even be this very long, complicated backstory. I'm thinking of one time I had to get my daughter tested for COVID before she had a procedure done. And the nurse that was doing this procedure was wonderful, and she was patient with my daughter. And I commented, I really appreciate you being, Sasha, stop rocking it. Come here. I commented, I said, I really appreciate you being patient and helping my daughter out. She does not want to be here or have anything shoved up her nose, but she had to get the test done. And the nurse said, I decided to be a nurse because when I was young, I had a nurse who was very patient and kind with me when I was afraid. And I just thought that was the most precious thing, and it was very simple and sweet, but yet so powerful. And it's amazing how people can have such a wonderful impact on our lives. So it could even be, just somebody had a really wonderful impact on your character as the backstory, and that has changed who they are, and that is why they have developed the way they have. That's why they make the decisions the way they do. Think about how in real life the pacing of how you learn about somebody else's backstory and how that comes about. So to recap, because you guys know I love my lists. 1, a backstory is the things that happened to the character before your story began. 2, the more solid the backstory is in your mind and the more you have it developed as the author, the more solid your character is going to be. 3, make sure whatever pieces of the backstory you end up putting into your story are important to the story and move it forward. 4, pace the bits and pieces of the backstory into the novel. Try to stay away from monologues or info dumps. And 5, the entire backstory does not necessarily have to go into the written story, as long as whatever pieces you have put in there make sense and the story is complete. Thank you so much for watching. Please comment down below if there is anything else you would like for me to talk about, if you have any questions about what I've already talked about, or if you would like for me to go into more detail. And now, go write.